Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the international affairs, foreign policy, and global development community, and world news aficionados of all stripes. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. The president of El Salvador is a political phenomenon. Nayib Bukele was elected in 2019 as a 37-year-old third-party candidate. He has a hipster's disposition, his trademark outfit is a backwards hat with jeans, and like millions of other millennials, he lives his life on Instagram for all to see. Bukele is wildly popular within El Salvador. His approval ratings are typically north of 90%, and his tenure so far has coincided with a sharp drop in gang-related violence and homicides that have long plagued El Salvador. Bukele is also very much an authoritarian. During his time in office, El Salvador has experienced significant democratic backsliding. He has targeted independent media and is undermining checks and balances against his rule. On May 1st, after his party won a supermajority in the legislature, he moved to oust a number of judges deemed insufficiently loyal. This prompted international rebuke, including from the United States. On the line to help explain the rise of Nayib Bukele and the demise of democratic checks and balances in El Salvador is Frida Ghitis. She is a world affairs analyst and columnist for World Politics Review, a contributing columnist to The Washington Post, and a regular contributor to CNN Opinion. We kick off discussing the sudden rise of Bukele in Salvadorian politics before entering into a discussion about the implications of his authoritarian tendencies. So just one note before we start. Today's episode is born out of a listener's recommendation. I always appreciate hearing your suggestions of topics I should cover or people I should interview, so please do keep them coming. You can hit me up on Twitter at Mark L. Goldberg or send me a note using the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com. I read all of your notes, I respond to all of them, and thank you for your suggestion, dear listener, of today's episode. For now, here is my conversation with Frida Ghitis.
Yeah, Bukele has an unusual background for somebody who has reached such heights of power. He dropped out of college and worked in his family's public relations business. And then he decided to try his hand at politics. He ran for mayor of a small town near the capital. And then he ran for the capital of El Salvador, San Salvador, which is, it's by far the largest city in the country. He was a part of the leftist party, the FMLN, and he fell out with them and ended up getting expelled, which may have been by design. And then he ran basically without a party. He ran for president. And what he did is that he just basically upended the structure of power, the structure of politics in El Salvador. The country had been dominated by a leftist party and a rightist party that were the heirs to the combatants of the Civil War during the Cold War. So by getting elected outside of that dual structure, he really turned everything upside down, and we've seen what's happened since then.
And it's maybe worth pointing out that part of his appeal is that he has this kind of brash personality. He's been described, and I think accurately so, as like a hipster millennial president. He has a ponytail, his signature backwards hat, wears jeans everywhere, is something of like an unusual sight in Latin American politics.
It is an absolutely unusual sight, and he is very good at social media. You can entertain yourself if you're not horrified at times reading his Twitter feed. He issues orders. It's a little bit Trumpian, but a little more, let's say, maybe not quite as insulting as Trump was. But he rules from Twitter, and he built his support in large part and via Twitter. He created a new form of populism in Central America. And, what I have to say, I think one of the biggest lessons from what we're seeing with Bukele is that the ground is set for a populist, for an authoritarian populist, when the environment is so rife with corruption. Bukele is a good marketing expert. He is a branding. He has a talent for branding. He has branded himself. He broke with what existed before, and now everybody recognizes, the beard, the backwards cap, the leather jacket, and his Twitter feed. He enters. It's basically his cape. He comes across as the savior, as the hero, and flies in to a place that has been basically destroyed by the existing power structure. So they have made it. They have opened the way for someone like him to take power, and it just shows how dangerous corruption is, how dangerous it is when you just cannot trust the established parties.
So he becomes president in 2019 in this kind of stunning upset that upends Salvadorian politics. What are some of his early moves as president that might presage what he would later kind of do and try to consolidate power?
So he came into office basically without a party. He attached himself to a smaller party so that he had a place to put his name on the ballot, but he didn't have a meaningful presence in the legislature. So what he did is he took to Twitter right away, and he started issuing orders. And the orders, if you're a Salvadorian who has been living in the middle of all this corruption, of the nepotism that has been so transparent, you see these orders where he goes on Twitter and he says, it is hereby ordered that the ministry of thus and such remove such and such a person who was named only because she is a relative of the previous president. And he starts doing things like that. And then he says, I have received an order for a new coffee maker. No, you don't need a coffee maker, bring your own coffee. He starts saying things like that. And, the Salvadorians know that there is graft everywhere. And the sight of this man who is not wearing a suit and tie, who looks like he's just rolling up his sleeves and getting to work to save the country money, it starts catching their attention, and it starts making some waves. And the people who are being addressed in this tweet say, yes, sir, Mr. President. And things start happening. Other things start happening also. Suddenly, he's replacing the people in the national media, the national television and radio organizations suddenly are being replaced with loyalists. And then another thing that starts happening is really, really crucial is that the crime rate, the murder rate, that in fact had already been declining before he took office, continues to go down at a pretty rapid clip. So if you're a poor Salvadorian, this looks really good. And what we have is a president whose approval rating is now somewhere around 90%, by far the highest in the region, one of the highest in the world. And as time passes, Bukele is massing power, and he's taking the power away from anyone who might challenge him. And for the public, this is not really a source of concern.
Yeah, well, as you just said, he is wildly popular. The data I saw suggested that he regularly reaches over 90% approval ratings in like scientific polling. These are not like internet polls. He really is wildly popular in El Salvador. And, as you said earlier, it's partly due to the fact that homicides and crimes associated with gang violence precipitously declined since he took office. Do you have a sense of how or why that is?
Well, this has happened before. A previous president made a deal with the gangs where he loosened some of the restrictions on gang members and gang chiefs in prison in exchange for a a slowdown in the murders around the country. There is a lot of talk that Bukele has done something along those lines. The murder rate was already declining, and the pandemic shut everything down. So we don't know how durable this is, but there is no question that the murder rate has dropped a lot. And the other thing that has dropped a lot is the respect for democracy in El Salvador. The people of El Salvador do not care about democracy, understandably, because democracy did not work very well for them before Bukele came to power.
So this spring, we saw what appears to be like a classic example of democratic backsliding, in which Bukele's party won overwhelmingly in legislative elections, giving him near total control of government. What has resulted from the fact that his party now has overwhelming control of the legislature?
Yeah, so when he was elected, the legislative elections are staggered, and the legislature that was just replaced had been elected before he ran. So his first couple of years, he did not have much of a representation in the legislature. In February, they had legislative elections, and his party is called Nuevas Ideas, New Ideas, won a supermajority, 2/3 of the seats. As soon as it took office, as soon as it was sworn in on May 1st, the first thing the assembly did was remove all the members of the Supreme Court's constitutional chamber, all of them. The judges immediately ruled that vote was unconstitutional. But that vote, their opinion did not count. They were replaced quickly, swiftly by new magistrates that came escorted by armed guard. And then the attorney general was also removed. So these people who were removed had been the last bastion of check on Bukele's power. They had, the attorney general was investigating corruption inside the Bukele administration. The magistrates in the Supreme Court had criticized them in another one of the most dramatic moments in his administration, which came last February, a year ago in February, when the assembly was going to vote on something that he had requested, a borrowing power that was being discussed, and Bukele was concerned that they weren't going to go along with him. So something really extraordinary happened. Bukele broke into the legislature with armed soldiers, and he personally sat in the chair of the president of the assembly. It was really a horrifying affront to democracy.
I've seen those videos and the images of Bukele there with armed guards in the middle of this legislative session, very obviously intending to influence and harass and intimidate the legislatures to vote for his budget increase.
Exactly. And at that time, the Supreme Court ordered the president to refrain from using the military for what it called activities contrary to established constitutional ends. So they were calling him on these things. They were speaking out against his authoritarian moves. He didn't like that. The Supreme Court also challenged some of his very draconian measures on the pandemic. So they were getting in his way. And he got rid of them.
So this decision to remove the judges and the attorney general led to some widespread international condemnation, including from the United States. This all happened, I believe, May 1st. So fairly recently from when we are speaking now. Can you just describe how the United States responded, how other countries in the region and around the world responded to this ostensibly very undemocratic move?
Yeah, well, it wasn't just the United States and other countries. Human Rights Watch has called Bukele's actions an assault on democracy, and the head of Human Rights Watch for the Americas says that Bukele is behaving exactly as Chavez did. That he is on a path to tyranny. And he said the way where we stand now, the people of El Salvador have absolutely no recourse right now once they realize what's happened. And he is saying, this is Jose Miguel Vivanco from Human Rights Watch, saying that it's really up to the international community now to try to figure out a way to slow down this march toward tyranny. The United States responded very, very swiftly. There were communications via social media and other means. Vice President Kamala Harris tweeted about deep concern about events in El Salvador. The State Department's head of Western Hemisphere affairs also said, she had already warned that what she said, the foundation of democracy rests on an independent judiciary. And without an independent judiciary, she said, democracy cannot live. And then Secretary of State Anthony Blinken phoned Bukele. And according to the official readout from Blinken, he expressed his grave concern over what's been happening and noted, and now this point is very, very important. He said that in the readout, Blinken noted that the Biden administration is prepared to spend billions of dollars to improve conditions, but improving conditions includes reinforcing democratic institutions. And he added the separation of power, free press, and civil society. So the United States is essentially threatening Bukele, saying, if you continue on this path, there is a big pot of money to help Central America, to help the Northern Triangle countries that send the largest share of migrants to the United States, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. If Bukele continues on this path, this money, it may not bypass El Salvador, but it's going to bypass him.
But so far, that doesn't seem to have swayed or influenced his decision-making.
Yeah, he responded, he said, mind your own business. But, your own business for the United States is how do they spend the $4 billion that Biden has promised to spend to improve conditions in Central America. So, that is the United States business because Salvadorians are leaving their country to come to the United States. And if the United States wants to spend a lot of money to improve conditions there, it has a right to decide how it does it. And I think what's going to happen is that the money is going to go to NGOs. But there's a big problem, and it's that Bukele is insanely popular in El Salvador. Mm-hmm. People really, really love him. And we've seen these transitory passions for autocrats before, and we've seen them in that region.
Yeah, I suppose the United States risks undermining its own sort of standing and views among the Salvadorian population if it condemns their popular leader too hard.
Yeah, it's a difficult it's a difficult needle to thread, mm-hmm. But it could do it. It has to speak gently and to some degree, but effectively. But in the end, El Salvador needs money. The other element in the equation these days is China. Mm-hmm. If El Salvador becomes an antagonist to the United States, and the United States is waving a lot of money for change, Bukele could look at China, which would be more than happy to help.
And he visited China fairly recently, did he not?
He did.
This was a very transparent display of potential leverage.
Yeah. It's interesting to see how all these, no politics is completely local anymore. Immigration is the most domestic and international topic of all, and what's happening in the border, along the border of the United States and Mexico, is domestic politics in the United States and in El Salvador, and it influences the behavior of China and Washington and the entire region. So it's a very interconnected world, and you have one guy with his backwards baseball cap on his head, delivering bags of beans and rice to people during a pandemic and building up his support at home, and those actions boosting his standing and having reverberations that reach across the oceans all the way around the world.
So it's also my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, that, part of the reason of his popularity is that he is sort of robustly spending on social welfare and other programs, which is, driving a huge debt burden on El Salvador. And, I saw that their debt compared to GDP was just like kind of enormous. And again, that seems to be like a potential ticking time bomb, if there's anything that might threaten or undermine his popularity or his rule.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see how he handles that. It's a problem that is not unique to El Salvador. We've seen what's happening in Colombia, where the government also went, went into a huge fiscal deficit, partly because of the pandemic, with the economy shrinking, and when the government started talking about raising taxes, we have a social explosion. Of course, there are a lot of different factors in each country, but this is going to be a problem across the region. And it's going to be interesting to see how Bukele navigates that. For now, he is just pushing ahead. He has a reservoir of goodwill with the public. So that's a huge advantage that the president of Colombia didn't have. He was very, very unpopular when he proposed higher taxes. Bukele is very popular. So he has silenced his critics. So he has the ability to shape the narrative almost completely. Very few people are questioning him or doubting him. So he'll be able to navigate this and to shape the reaction more than almost any elected leader right now.
Lastly, in the coming weeks or months, are there any inflection points coming up that you would point listeners to that, might suggest to you how things will play out in El Salvador in terms of, further democratic backsliding? Are there any events, elections, or anything that you might point to that will kind of be key moments of inflection?
Well, he was elected for a 5-year term, so he's still got a lot of time before that happens. I would not be surprised at all if we see the legislature talk about rewriting the Constitution. That is the traditional path for cementing an autocracy in Latin America and really around the world these days. It's the Chavez method. We saw it in many, many countries where we may see something like in Nicaragua with Daniel Ortega, where the presidency just never ends. But in the near future, and we also just had a legislative election. So both of those elections are far away. I think maybe what we should keep an eye on is what happens with Washington, with the U.S. aid to Central America. That's a lot of money. $4 billion is a huge amount of money in a region where the countries are very small and very poor. So I would keep an eye on that and just watch his approval ratings. Watch what happens with the economy as the pandemic restrictions eventually start to be eased and there's a sense of normalcy. Let's see what happens with the crime rate when the pandemic restrictions start being opened up, and let's keep an eye on his ties with China.
Well, Frida, thank you so much. This was very helpful.
Okay, thank you very much for having me.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Frida Ghitis. Thank you to the listener who suggested this topic for an episode of the podcast. And as I said at the outset, please do get in touch with me if you have suggestions of topics that I should cover. Thank you. All right. We'll see you next time. Bye.